Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. I'm just so thrilled to have you here today, because in this explainer, we're going to unpack the hidden and honestly, sometimes completely wild history of one of the world's most famous newspapers. For literally centuries, this publication has been a cornerstone of global media. But the story of how it got there and how it managed to actually stay there, it is absolutely fascinating.
Okay, let's dive into this. How does a tiny 2.5-penny broadsheet become this massive institution that actively shapes world history? I mean, we're talking about a publication that went from, testing out typography to literally swaying empires. It's a huge leap. And today, we're going to map out exactly how that whole shebang happened.
So just so we know exactly where we're headed, here's our roadmap for today. First, the birth of the Thunderer. Second, pigeons, codes, and tombs. Third, the Fourth Estate myth. And finally, surviving the modern era.
Starting with Section 1, the birth of the Thunderer, the Times origins.
Let's jump all the way back to London in 1785. The paper's founder, John Walter, had this incredibly ambitious vision right from day one. In his opening editorial for what was originally called the Daily Universal Register, he wrote that a newspaper ought to be the register of the times and faithful recorder of every species of intelligence. Pretty grand, right? By 1788, he officially shortened the name to just The Times and set off to create this historical record that would appeal to everyone, from politicians down to commercial traders. Now, throughout the 19th century, the publication picked up some pretty legendary nicknames that perfectly captured its vibe. The most famous, by far, is the Thunderer. They earned this because the paper's editorials were so bold, so unyielding and authoritative, that they literally had the power to sway political discourse. It was like a thunderclap in the political scene. You might also hear it called the Gray Lady, which is a nod to its sober, mature, and highly reliable tone. The takeaway here is that these weren't just cute little labels. They reflected a newspaper that had successfully cemented itself as a formidable pillar of British society.
Moving into Section 2, pigeons, codes, and tombs. This is all about their adventurous reporting.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the Times racked up an incredible list of journalistic firsts. They sent the very first dedicated war correspondent, a guy named William Howard Russell, to witness the Crimean War firsthand. During the siege of Khartoum, they literally used carrier pigeons to fly notes back. I mean, some of those were even intercepted by the Boers. When they were covering the first ascent of Mount Everest or reporting from Poland during martial law in 1982, reporters actually smuggled out coded messages. In Poland, they shortened the word solidarity to just the letter S so border guards wouldn't catch on and destroy their reports. Oh, and right in the middle of all this crazy history, in 1932, they just casually invented Times New Roman, which is now basically the most popular font in the world, simply because they wanted to make their paper easier to read.
But as you can imagine, being first was definitely not cheap. Just look at this number, £3,500. That was the expense bill submitted for the Times' exclusive access to the opening of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923. To put that into perspective, in today's money, that is roughly £137,000. And speaking of creative expense claims, we absolutely have to mention Kim Philby. He was a Times correspondent who was actually later outed as a Soviet spy. Well, during a super chaotic military retreat in 1940, he submitted an expense claim that included a camel hair overcoat and pigskin gloves. I mean, you really kind of have to admire the audacity. All right, on to Section 3, the Fourth Estate myth, re-evaluating power. While all those anecdotes are a ton of fun, we really need to shift gears and look at how academics view the true power of this publication. By the mid-19th century, the Times was heavily promoting this really high-minded concept of itself as part of the Fourth Estate. Basically, this is the idea that the press acts as a completely neutral, independent guardian of public interests against the state. The paper loved to claim that its only master was public sentiment, and that it was just an infallible barometer of what the nation was thinking. It's this beautiful, democratic ideal, but historians have really started to question how accurate that actually was. Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is the stark contrast between that myth and the actual historical reality. According to a thesis by historian T.P. Morley, who dug into the paper's role during the massive revolutionary crisis of 1848, the Times was absolutely not a passive, neutral mirror. Not at all. Instead, Morley argues it was an active orchestrator.
During that crazy year of European revolutions and Chartist protests, the paper aggressively constructed a version of reality that defended the vital interests of the possessing classes. It didn't just reflect opinion, it directed it. It managed the fears of the elite and essentially manufactured consensus. It is such a brilliant reminder that the media doesn't just report the world to us, it actively helps construct our entire view of it. Which brings us to Section 4, Surviving the Modern Era, the Business of News. Wielding that kind of immense power requires immense capital. Throughout the 20th century, the paper went through these rapid-fire ownership changes just to keep the lights on. By 1900, the paper was losing money and hemorrhaging readers. It had to be saved by Lord Northcliffe in 1908. Then it was passed to the Astor family in 1922. A huge financial crisis in the 60s led to a buyout by Canadian magnate Roy Thomson in 1966. But look at 1978. A massive crisis forced the paper to completely shut down for nearly a year. This vulnerability is what ultimately opened the door for Australian media magnate Rupert Murdoch to swoop in and purchase the paper in 1981, bringing the massive resources they desperately needed to fund modernization. Let's pause on that 1978 shutdown for a second, because it was a huge breaking point. A really bitter industrial dispute over the introduction of new technology and manning levels resulted in a massive strike. For nearly a year, not a single paper was printed. Can you imagine? The dispute allegedly cost the owners a staggering £30 million. Management finally realized they desperately needed a buyer who could guarantee the survival of the title and actually fight for modern printing methods, which, of course, led directly to that Murdoch acquisition. To drag the brand out of what was actually described at the time as gloomy medieval darkness, some pretty extreme survival tactics were needed. First up, Murdoch relocated the printing presses to a highly secure facility that people dubbed Wapping Castle, just to bypass massive Union blockades. Second, in a huge break from centuries of tradition, the paper completely abandoned its massive broadsheet size in 2004, switching entirely to a much more convenient tabloid format. Finally, recognizing that print alone just wasn't going to cut it anymore, they aggressively expanded into a fully digital media brand, complete with interactive websites and a vast podcast network. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why that digital pivot was absolutely 100% necessary. You can see this massive spike in the late 90s, peaking in the year 2000 with an average circulation of over 726,000. Huge, right? But then, by 2019, it drops all the way back down to around 417,000. The rise of the internet fundamentally fractured how we consume news, pulling readers away from physical print. The times had to evolve, or it literally would have become just another artifact of history. Which brings us to our final thought. We've seen how the Times used its immense authority and, well, maybe even a little orchestration to shape the political and social reality of the Victorian era. But history isn't just about looking backwards, is it? It's a mirror for the present. So I want to leave you with this question. If a legacy newspaper shaped the reality of the Victorians, how is today's digital media shaping yours? Seriously, think about the algorithms, the headlines, and the feeds you are consuming every single day. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the right questions.